The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Adelaide Cottage as William Cambridge stood at the kitchen window, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. His usually composed demeanor showed cracks of worry as he watched his children playing in the garden, their laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air. Sat at the kitchen table behind him, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the pages of a medical report that had arrived in the Morning Post. The silence between them spoke volumes. For weeks, they had been living in a state of suspended animation, waiting for news that could change everything. This recent health scare had shaken them to their core, reminding them both of how fragile life could be, even for those who seemed to have everything. The preliminary tests had been inconclusive, and the waiting was perhaps the hardest part of all. William turned from the window, his blue eyes meeting across the room. She looked up from the papers, and he saw his own fears reflected in her face. They had been through so much together over the years, weathering public scrutiny, family dramas, and the constant pressure of their royal duties. But this felt different. This was personal in a way that cut through all the protocols and procedures that usually govern their lives. The house phone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the morning quiet like a knife. Both of them froze, neither wanting to be the one to answer it. They knew it could be Dr. Richardson from the London clinic with the results they had been dreading to hear. His hand moved instinctively to her chest, where she had been experiencing the troubling symptoms that had started this whole nightmare. William walked slowly to the phone, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. As he reached for the receiver, he caught Sai's eye one more time. She nodded slightly, giving him the silent encouragement he needed. Whatever news awaited them, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else in their marriage. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, but William could hear something in Dr. Richardson's tone that made his heart race. As he listened to the medical explanation, his free hand gripped the edge of the kitchen counter until his knuckles turned white. Watched his face intently, trying to read the news in his expressions before he had even finished the call. When William finally hung up the phone, the silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever. He stood with his back to, his shoulders sagging under the weight of what he had just learned. The morning light streaming through the windows suddenly seemed too bright, too cheerful for the gravity of the moment they were facing. Stood up from the table, the medical report scattered, forgotten across its surface. She walked over to her husband, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the way his body seemed to be holding itself together through sheer force of will. Without words, she knew that the news had not been what they had hoped to hear. William finally turned to face her, and she saw tears threatening to spill from his eyes. This man who had stood stoically through state funerals and public ceremonies, who had maintained his composure through family scandals and media storms, was struggling to hold back his emotions in the privacy of their own kitchen. The sight of his vulnerability made her own eyes begin to well up with tears. They stood there facing each other, two people who had spent their lives in the public eye but were now confronting something deeply private and personal. The children's voices could still be heard from the garden, a reminder of all they had to fight for, all the reasons why giving up was not an option. Whatever came next, they would need to find strength not just for themselves, but for George, Charlotte, and Louis. The day ahead stretched before them, filled with decisions that would need to be made and conversations that would need to be had. But for this moment, they simply held each other in their kitchen, allowing themselves to feel the full weight of their fear and uncertainty. The strong facade they maintained for the world could wait. Right now, they were just William and a husband and wife facing the unknown together. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the trees, and their children's laughter continued to drift through the windows. Life was carrying on around them, oblivious to the storm that was brewing inside the cottage. Soon, they would need to step back into their public roles, to smile and wave and carry out their duties as they always did. But the conversation they had just had would change everything, setting in motion a series of events that would test their marriage, their family, and their resolve in ways they had never imagined. The medical report on the table seemed to mock them with its clinical language and impersonal tone. Numbers and percentages that reduced fears to statistics, her symptoms to data points that doctors could analyze but never truly understand. She thought about all the public appearances she would need to cancel, the careful explanations that would need to be crafted for the press office, the way their private struggle would inevitably become public knowledge. As the morning wore on, they began the difficult process of planning their next steps. Phone calls to family members who would need to be informed, conversations with their staff about adjusting schedules, and the heart-wrenching task of deciding how and when to tell their children about what was happening. Each decision felt monumental, each choice carrying the weight of consequences that would ripple through their lives and the lives of those around them. The privacy they had fought so hard to protect for their family was about to be challenged in new ways. Soon, there would be speculation in the press, concerned messages from well-wishers around the world, and the constant scrutiny that came with living their lives in the public eye. But for now, in the quiet of their kitchen, they were just two people facing an uncertain future, drawing strength from each other and the love that had brought them through so many challenges before. 3 weeks had passed since that devastating morning phone call, and the Cambridge household had settled into an uncomfortable new routine. Treatment schedule dictated their days now, with early morning appointments at the London clinic becoming as regular as school runs and royal engagements once had been. William had quietly stepped back from several of his patronages, delegating responsibilities to other members of the royal family while keeping his reasons deliberately vague in official statements. The children had sensed the change in their parents' behavior, though George, Charlotte, and Louis had been told only that their mother needed some special medical care. 8-year-old George, perceptive beyond his years, had begun asking more pointed questions that William and struggled to answer without revealing the full truth. The weight of protecting their children's innocence while dealing with their own fears was proving to be one of their greatest challenges. Sat in the passenger seat of their Range Rover as William navigated the familiar route to street, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The London traffic seemed heavier than usual, or perhaps time was just moving differently now that every moment felt precious. She watched people walking on the sidewalks, going about their normal lives, and felt a strange disconnect from the world outside their car windows. The treatment sessions themselves were becoming routine, but the emotional toll was cumulative. Had always been private about her health, even more so than most members of the royal family. The idea of her personal struggle potentially becoming public knowledge filled her with a different kind of dread than the medical concerns themselves. She had worked so hard to establish herself as a strong, capable member of the royal family, and the thought of being seen as fragile or vulnerable went against everything she had built. William glanced over at his wife as they sat in traffic, noting the way she was unconsciously touching the silk scarf she had begun wearing to cover the small changes in her appearance that the treatment was beginning to cause. He had suggested they hire a driver for these trips, but had insisted she wanted to maintain as much normalcy as possible. These car rides had become some of their most honest conversations, away from the children and the staff, and the constant awareness that their home was never truly private. Dr. Richardson had been cautiously optimistic during their last consultation, explaining that response to the initial treatment was encouraging. But medical optimism felt different when you were living it rather than observing it. Every good day was shadowed by the knowledge that setbacks were possible, every milestone celebrated with the quiet fear that it might be temporary. The uncertainty was perhaps harder to bear than a definitive diagnosis would have been. The media speculation had begun in earnest the previous week, when had missed her third consecutive public engagement. The official explanation of a minor health concern requiring rest had only fueled more intense scrutiny. Photographers with long-range lenses had been spotted near their country home, and the palace press office was fielding dozens of calls daily from journalists fishing for more details. The irony was not lost on that her attempt to keep her health private had generated more attention than if they had simply been transparent from the beginning. William's phone buzzed with a text message from his private secretary, updating him on the latest media inquiries and suggesting some adjustments to their strategy for managing the public narrative. He glanced at the message and then put the phone away without responding. For once, the palace machinery of crisis management would have to wait. His priority was the woman sitting beside him, who was trying so hard to appear strong while fighting a battle that no amount of protocol training had prepared her for. They pulled into the clinic's private entrance, where Dr. Richardson's team had worked to ensure visits could happen with minimal exposure to cameras and curious onlookers. The irony of needing to sneak into medical appointments was not lost on either of them. Had once joked that she felt like she was having an affair, all this sneaking around and carefully timed entrances and exits. The treatment room had become familiar territory, with its soft lighting and comfortable chairs that somehow never felt comfortable enough. settled into her usual spot while William took the chair beside her, a routine they had developed without discussion. He would bring work to do during the longer sessions, but more often than not, he would just sit and read, or sometimes they would talk quietly about anything except why they were there. Today felt different, though. Dr. Richardson entered with a manila folder that seemed thicker than usual, and his expression carried a gravity that made both William and sit up. The preliminary results from his latest round of tests had come back, and there were some developments that needed to be discussed. The careful optimism from their previous meetings was replaced by a more measured tone that sent warning signals through both of their minds. As Dr. Richardson began explaining the latest test results, felt William's hand find hers and squeeze gently. The medical terminology washed over them like a foreign language, even though they had both become reluctant experts in the vocabulary of her condition over the past few weeks. Words like progression and adjustment and alternative approaches took on weight that they had never carried before in their lives. The adjustment to treatment plan would require more frequent visits to the clinic, potentially including some overnight stays for observation. The practical implications began cascading through William's mind immediately: how to explain extended absences to the children, how to manage the increased risk of media attention, how to maintain their family's routine when nothing about their situation was routine anymore. His medical team had been preparing a more comprehensive treatment strategy, one that would require them to make some difficult decisions about her public duties over the coming months. The conversation they had been dreading was now unavoidable. They would need to make a public statement about her health, if only to prevent the media speculation from spiraling completely out of control. As they left the clinic that afternoon, both William and were quieter than usual. The weight of the new information they had received sat heavily between them, along with the growing realization that their private struggle was about to become much more public. The careful balance they had tried to maintain between openness and privacy was about to shift dramatically. The drive home through London's familiar streets felt different this time. They passed landmarks that had been part of their lives for so long, places where they had made public appearances, attended events, carried out the duties that had defined their public personas. Now those same locations seemed to represent a life that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain while dealing with the reality of his health situation. When they finally pulled into their driveway at Adelaide Cottage, the children were waiting for them on the front steps, having been released early from their lessons. George, Charlotte, and Louis ran to greet their parents with the uncomplicated joy that only children can bring to difficult moments. For a brief instant, watching their children's faces light up at their return, both William and could forget about test results and treatment plans and focus simply on being parents who were loved unconditionally. But as they walked into their home together, the weight of the decisions they needed to make pressed down on them again. The conversation with the children could no longer be delayed, and the public statement would need to be carefully crafted to balance honesty with privacy. Their quiet battle was about to become a very public journey, whether they were ready for it or not. The decision to tell the children had kept William awake most of the previous night, staring at the ceiling while slept restlessly beside him. They had agreed that George, at 8 years old, was mature enough to understand more of the truth, while Charlotte and Louis would need a gentler explanation suited to their ages. The conversation they had been dreading could no longer be postponed, especially with treatment schedule becoming more intensive. Saturday morning found the family gathered in their favorite room at Adelaide Cottage, the cozy sitting room where they often spent weekend mornings reading together or playing board games. The children were sprawled on the carpet with coloring books and puzzles, unaware that their parents were about to share news that would change their understanding of their world. William sat on the edge of the sofa while curled up in the corner, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that she wasn't really drinking. George looked up from his drawing when he noticed both parents watching them instead of reading their usual Saturday newspapers. His young face showed the same perceptive expression that often reminded visitors of his father at that age. Charlotte was humming softly as she carefully colored within the lines of her picture book, while Louis was more interested in making his toy cars crash into each other than any artistic pursuits. Cleared her throat gently, the sound causing all three children to look up expectantly. She had rehearsed this conversation in her mind dozens of times, but now that the moment had arrived, all her carefully planned words seemed inadequate. How do you explain serious illness to children who still believe their parents are invincible? William moved to sit on the floor with the children, his long legs folding awkwardly as he positioned himself at their level. The physical act of coming down to their perspective seemed symbolic somehow, acknowledging that this conversation would require him to be vulnerable in a way that his royal training had never prepared him for. George immediately scooted closer to his father, sensing the gravity of the moment even if he couldn't yet identify what it meant. Began with the gentle explanation they had practiced, telling the children that she had been feeling unwell and that the doctors were helping her get better. Charlotte's immediate concern was whether this meant they couldn't have their planned trip to Balmoral, while Louis wanted to know if his mother would still be able to read him bedtime stories. Their innocent questions highlighted how children's priorities differed so fundamentally from adult worries about prognosis and treatment outcomes. George's questions were more pointed, asking why the doctor's visits were taking so long and why both parents seemed so worried if the doctors were helping. His 8-year-old logic was beginning to piece together clues that his parents had hoped he wouldn't notice. William found himself struggling to maintain the careful balance between honesty and age-appropriate information, wanting to respect his son's intelligence while still protecting his childhood innocence. The conversation continued for over an hour, with breaks for hugs and reassurances as the children processed what they were being told. Charlotte wanted to draw a picture for her mother to take to the doctor, convinced that her artistic efforts would somehow speed up the healing process. Louis, at 4 years old, seemed more concerned with whether this meant changes to his routine than with understanding the medical aspects of his mother's situation. As the morning wore on, the children's resilience began to emerge in ways that both surprised and comforted their parents. George announced that he would help take care of his younger siblings more than usual, showing a maturity that made his eyes fill with tears she was determined not to shed in front of the children. Charlotte declared that she would make her mother tea every day because tea made everything better. Louis simply climbed into his lap and announced that he would stay there to make sure she didn't feel sick anymore. The family spent the rest of that Saturday in a bubble of togetherness that felt both precious and fragile. They built a massive fort out of sofa cushions and blankets, with the children insisting that it was a special healing castle where no one could feel worried or scared. William found himself taking more pictures than usual, capturing moments that seemed to carry extra significance now that they all understood how precious their time together truly was. Sunday brought a return to some version of normalcy, with the children's questions becoming more practical and less fearful as they began to adjust to their new understanding of the situation. George asked if he could come to one of his mother's doctor appointments, showing a protectiveness that reminded of William's own fierce loyalty. Charlotte wanted to know if her mother's medicine tasted bad and offered to share her favorite sweets to make it better. The palace press office had been preparing for the inevitable public statement about his health, working with William and to craft language that would provide enough information to satisfy public concern while maintaining the privacy that the family desperately needed. The challenge was finding words that acknowledged the seriousness of the situation without creating panic or speculation about worst-case scenarios. Media attention had intensified over the weekend, with photographers camping outside various locations where the family might appear. The children's school had been briefed on the situation and had increased their security measures discreetly. Even their weekend trip to the local farmers' market, once a cherished family tradition, now required careful planning and coordination with protection officers. His treatment schedule for the coming week included her first overnight stay at the clinic for a more intensive round of therapy. The logistics of managing this while maintaining their children's routines required careful coordination between William's schedule and the team of nannies and support staff who helped keep their household running. Every decision now carried the weight of balancing medical needs with their family's emotional. The hardest part was the gradual loss of spontaneity in their family life. Simple decisions like whether to attend George's football match or take Charlotte to her ballet lesson now required careful consideration of her energy levels and treatment schedule. The freedom to be impulsive parents was being replaced by the need to plan everything around medical appointments and recovery time. William had begun having regular conversations with his father and brother about adjusting royal duties to accommodate treatment schedule. The institution of the monarchy was designed to continue functioning regardless of individual circumstances, but the personal cost of that continuity was becoming increasingly clear. Balancing his roles as a husband, father, and future king had never felt more challenging. The children's bedtime routines had evolved to include extra time for stories and cuddles, as if they instinctively understood that these moments needed to be savored. Found herself memorizing details about these evenings. The way Charlotte's hair smelled like strawberry shampoo, the feel of Louis's small hand in hers, the serious expression on George's face when he asked his thoughtful questions about the day. As the weekend drew to a close, both William and felt a mixture of relief and apprehension about the week ahead. They had successfully navigated the difficult conversation with their children and had seen the resilience and love that would sustain their family through whatever challenges lay ahead. But they also knew that the hardest parts of their journey were still to come, and that their private struggle was about to become increasingly public. The Sunday evening routine of preparing for the week ahead felt different now, with medical appointments taking precedence over other commitments. William's diary had been cleared of all but the most essential engagements, and backup plans had been put in place for every scenario the palace staff could anticipate. The careful choreography of royal life had been adjusted to accommodate a very human crisis that didn't follow any protocol manual. That night, as they tucked their children into bed, both parents felt the weight of all the unknowns that lay ahead. But they also felt the strength that came from facing those unknowns together, supported by three small people who loved them unconditionally, and an extended family that was rallying around them in ways both public and private. The morning of first overnight stay at the clinic arrived gray and drizzling, as if the weather was reflecting the mood that had settled over Adelaide Cottage. William helped her pack a small overnight bag, both of them moving through the routine with a careful normalcy that didn't quite mask their underlying anxiety. Had insisted on maintaining her usual morning routine with the children, making their breakfast and helping them get ready for school as if this day was no different from any other. George lingered at the breakfast table longer than usual, asking questions about homework that he already knew the answers to. His 8-year-old intuition told him that something significant was happening, even though his parents had explained this was just a longer doctor's appointment that required staying overnight for observation. Charlotte had drawn another picture for her mother to take with her, this one featuring their entire family holding hands under a rainbow, with the words, "Get better soon, Mama," written in her careful handwriting. The drive to London felt longer than usual, with conversation flowing in starts and stops as both William and found themselves lost in their own thoughts. They had received an update from Dr. Richardson the previous evening about the treatment plan for overnight stay, and while the information was presented with clinical optimism, they both understood that this represented a significant escalation in her care. The clinic had arranged for her to have a private suite on their executive floor, complete with accommodations for William to stay overnight if he chose. The thoughtful gesture highlighted how different their situation was from other patients, who didn't require private entrances and specially arranged visiting hours to avoid media attention. Sometimes wondered if the special treatment made her medical situation more or less real somehow. As they settled into the comfortable but unmistakably clinical room, unpacked the few personal items she had brought to make the space feel less institutional. Charlotte's drawing went on the bedside table, along with a small framed photo of the three children that William had tucked into her bag as a surprise. The afternoon stretched ahead of them with a mixture of medical procedures and waiting periods that had become the rhythm of their new normal. Dr. Richardson arrived with his team for the initial consultation, bringing with him the results of latest scans and blood work. The news was a mixture of encouraging progress and concerning developments that required the more intensive treatment protocol they were beginning. Listened to the medical explanation with the focused attention she had developed over the past weeks, asking the practical questions that had become second nature to her. William found himself studying the faces of the medical team as they spoke, looking for subtle clues in their expressions that might reveal more than their carefully professional words conveyed. He had become an expert at reading between the lines of medical consultations, understanding that optimism in oncology was always carefully qualified, and that good news was often accompanied by cautionary explanations about next steps. The first round of treatment began in the early afternoon, with settling into the specialized chair that would be her home for the next several hours. William positioned himself in the comfortable visitor's chair beside her, his laptop open with work that he would probably not accomplish, while his attention remained focused on monitoring every aspect of his wife's comfort and. As the treatment progressed, they fell into the quiet conversation patterns they had developed during these sessions. would doze periodically, and William would use those times to catch up on correspondence or return phone calls that couldn't be delayed. The normalcy of dealing with diary scheduling and patronage obligations felt surreal when contrasted with the IV line running into his arm and the steady beeping of monitoring equipment. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor when Queen Elizabeth arrived for what the staff had been told was a routine check on another patient in the facility. Knew immediately that her grandmother-in-law had come specifically to see her, despite the official explanation that made the visit seem coincidental. The Queen's presence filled the room with a different kind of energy, bringing with it the weight of institutional support and personal concern that had characterized her response to diagnosis. The conversation between the three of them was careful and formal at first, following the protocols that governed even the most personal interactions within the royal family. But as the visit progressed, the Queen's genuine affection for became evident in small gestures and concerned questions about how the children were adjusting to the changes in their routine. Her offer to take a more active role in George, Charlotte, and Louis's activities was presented as a suggestion rather than a directive, but they all understood the significance of having the monarch personally invested in their families. Evening brought the shift change among the medical staff and the settling in routines that marked the transition from day to night in the clinical environment. Dinner arrived on fine china rather than the standard hospital trays, another reminder of how her status changed even the most mundane aspects of medical care. William had arranged for their chef to prepare some of her favorite foods, understanding that familiar tastes might provide comfort in an unfamiliar environment. The overnight monitoring required to remain connected to various devices that would track her response to the treatment throughout the night. Sleep would be interrupted by regular checks from the nursing staff, but the room had been arranged to minimize disruptions while ensuring her safety. William had initially planned to stay in the adjoining family room, but had gently suggested that he go home to be with the children for their bedtime routine. The good-night phone call with George, Charlotte, and Louis became a cherished ritual that evening. Each child had prepared something special to share with their mother. George had practiced a piano piece he wanted to play for her over the phone. Charlotte had another drawing to describe in detail, and Louis simply wanted to tell her about every toy he had played with during the day. The normalcy of their chatter provided a connection to the life waiting for her outside the clinical environment. William's return home to Adelaide Cottage that evening was marked by a quiet emptiness that the children's presence couldn't quite fill. His usual evening routine of reviewing the next day's schedule and returning missed calls felt mechanical without parallel activities happening nearby. The master bedroom felt too large and too quiet, despite the monitor that connected him to the children's rooms down the hall. The overnight hours at the clinic brought periodic updates from the nursing staff about its response to the treatment, each check-in providing reassurance that the new protocol was proceeding as expected. Found herself wide awake during many of the quiet hours, staring out the window at the London cityscape and thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months earlier, her biggest concerns had been about royal tour scheduling and the children's summer holiday plans. Morning brought Dr. Richardson's early rounds and the gradual process of disconnecting from the overnight monitoring equipment. The initial assessment of her response to the intensified treatment was cautiously positive, but they would need to wait for blood work results to get a clearer picture of the protocol's effectiveness. The careful optimism in the medical team's voices had become familiar, but had learned to find genuine hope in their measured enthusiasm. The process of preparing to leave the clinic involved the same careful coordination that had marked her arrival. William returned early with fresh clothes and updates from home about the children's morning routines and school preparations. George had drawn a welcome home sign that was waiting for her return, while Charlotte had picked flowers from their garden as a homecoming bouquet. As they drove home through the familiar London streets, both William and felt the weight of having crossed another threshold in their journey. The overnight stay had been successful from a medical standpoint, but it had also represented a deepening of patient identity in a way that felt both necessary and difficult. The balance between being a royal duchess and being someone who required intensive medical care was becoming increasingly complex to navigate. The homecoming at Adelaide Cottage was marked by the children's genuine excitement and relief at having both parents back under the same roof. The house felt more complete somehow, as if absence had highlighted how much their family's harmony depended on everyone being present and accounted for. The afternoon was spent in deliberate ordinariness, with games and stories and the kind of lazy family time that had become more precious since diagnosis. That evening, as they settled back into their familiar routines, both William and understood that they had successfully navigated another milestone in his treatment journey. The intensive overnight protocol would need to be repeated several more times over the coming weeks, but they had proven to themselves and their children that their family could adapt and endure even the most challenging circumstances while maintaining the love and connection that had always been their greatest strength. 6 months after that first devastating phone call, stood in front of the bathroom mirror at Adelaide Cottage, studying her reflection with eyes that had learned to see hope where once there had been only fear. The woman looking back at her was different now, marked by experiences that had stripped away any pretense about the invincibility she had once taken for granted. Her hair had grown back softer than before, and there was a depth in her eyes that spoke of battles fought and won in ways that only she and William truly understood. The latest round of test results had brought the news they had been afraid to hope for. Dr. Richardson's call that morning had been filled with genuine excitement rather than the careful optimism that had characterized their conversations for so many months. The treatment had been more successful than anyone had dared predict, and while the word remission still felt too fragile to speak aloud, the medical team was confident enough to begin discussing a return to normal activities. Downstairs, the sounds of family life continued with the chaotic energy that had learned never to take for granted. George's voice carried up the stairs as he explained something earnestly to his younger siblings, his tone carrying the authority he had developed as the family's unofficial protector during the months when both parents had needed his help in ways that no 8-year-old should have to provide. Charlotte was practicing piano in the music room, her determined repetition of scales providing a soundtrack to the morning routine that had evolved around his treatment schedule. William found her standing at the window, still wearing the silk robe she had put on after her shower, watching their children play in the garden with an intensity that he recognized from the hardest days of her treatment. Those moments when she would seem to be memorizing every detail, storing up images against an uncertain future that they had both feared might not include enough mornings like this one. The public statement about his health had been released 3 months earlier, carefully crafted to acknowledge the seriousness of her condition while maintaining the privacy that had become even more precious to their family. The response had been overwhelming in its support, with messages pouring in from around the world and a level of public sympathy that had surprised them both. Had been particularly moved by the letters from other patients and families dealing with similar diagnoses, people who understood the journey in ways that no amount of royal training could have prepared her for. Today marked another kind of milestone, though one that would receive no public announcement or official recognition, was returning to royal duties for the first time since her diagnosis, starting with a private meeting with one of her patronages that afternoon. The decision to resume her public role had been made gradually, with careful consultation between her medical team, William, and the palace staff who had worked tirelessly to maintain her various commitments during her absence. The children had been told about their mother's improving health with the same careful honesty that had characterized all their conversations throughout her treatment. George's relief had been immediate and visible, as if he had been holding his breath for months and could finally exhale. Charlotte had announced that this meant they could definitely go on their planned family holiday to Scotland, a trip that had been postponed twice due to treatment schedules. Louis, now 5 and more aware of the gravity of what his family had been through, had simply climbed into his mother's lap and refused to leave her side for the rest of the day. William's role as both husband and caregiver had evolved throughout his treatment in ways that had deepened their marriage beyond anything either of them had imagined possible. He had learned to read the subtle signs of her discomfort before she acknowledged them herself, had become fluent in the language of medical consultations and treatment protocols, and had discovered reserves of patience and strength that had surprised them both. The public had seen glimpses of this during his few appearances without, when reporters had noted the shadows under his eyes, and the way his usual easy smile had been replaced by something more guarded and fierce. The afternoon meeting with the children's mental health charity that had championed for years felt both familiar and foreign after her months away. The staff members who greeted her were carefully cheerful, clearly briefed on how to acknowledge her absence without dwelling on the reasons for it, but found herself genuinely interested in the program updates and new initiatives that had continued developing during her treatment, reminded of how much satisfaction she had always derived from work that felt meaningful beyond its ceremonial aspects. The conversation with the charity's director revealed how much the organization had missed her personal involvement, not just her royal patronage, but the genuine engagement she had always brought to understanding their mission. Realized that her experience as a patient had given her new insight into the vulnerability that the charity's young clients experienced, and she began to see how her own journey might eventually inform her advocacy work in ways she was only beginning to understand. Driving home through the familiar countryside around their cottage, felt the strange sensation of rediscovering a life that had been temporarily suspended rather than permanently lost. The hedgerows were the same deep green they had always been. The village shops displayed the same cheerful window displays, but her perception of it all had been fundamentally altered by months of seeing the world through the lens of medical uncertainty. That evening, the family gathered in the kitchen for dinner in a scene that looked identical to hundreds of similar evenings from before diagnosis. But the quality of attention everyone paid to the ordinary details felt different now. George's story about his mathematics lesson received more focused listening than it might have 6 months earlier. Charlotte's elaborate description of her art project was met with questions that showed genuine interest in every detail. Louis's typical 5-year-old chatter about his various toy adventures was received as if it contained information of vital importance. William and exchanged glances across the dinner table, a communication that had been refined by months of sharing concerns too complex for words. Tonight, those glances carried relief and gratitude rather than worry and fear. The simple fact of being together around their own table, with healthy appetites and energy for family conversation, felt like a gift that they had learned not to assume they would always have. As they tucked the children into bed that night, each bedtime routine carried the extra tenderness that had become their family's hallmark during the challenging months. George's serious goodnight hug lasted a few seconds longer than usual, and knew he was still processing the reassurance that his mother was truly going to be all right. Charlotte's bedtime story request was for one of the fairy tales where everyone lived happily ever after, a choice that felt particularly significant given their recent journey through uncertainty. Later, as William and sat in their own sitting room with cups of tea that had grown cold while they talked about plans for the coming weeks, they both marveled at how ordinary their conversation had become again. Discussions about school schedules and royal engagements and summer holiday possibilities felt luxurious in their mundaneness after months of conversations dominated by medical appointments and treatment protocols. The master bedroom that night felt like a sanctuary they had reclaimed rather than simply returned to. Bedside table no longer held the collection of medications and medical information that had cluttered it for so many months. In their place were the usual books and family photos and small personal items that had once seemed too trivial to notice, but now felt like symbols of a normal life restored. As they settled into sleep, both William and understood that their journey was not completely finished. Regular monitoring appointments would continue for years, and the memory of uncertainty would always be part of their story now. But the acute crisis had passed, and they had discovered that their family was stronger and more resilient than either of them had known. The love that had brought them through the darkest months was still there, perhaps deeper and more appreciated than it had ever been before. The last thing thought about before falling asleep was the sound of her children's voices from that morning, arguing about something completely insignificant in the way that only healthy, secure children can argue. It was a sound she had missed during the quiet days when everyone had been too careful and too worried to engage in ordinary family conflicts. The return of normal childhood chaos felt like the most precious sign of all that their family had truly healed from the experience that had tested them, in ways they never could have anticipated. Outside their bedroom window, the English countryside settled into the peaceful quiet of late evening, and inside Adelaide Cottage, a family slept soundly with the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another ordinary day in a life they had learned never to take for granted.